Tonight, on a special edition of World News, a congresswoman shot at point-blank range. Representative Gabrielle Giffords and more than a dozen others, including a federal judge, all gunned down outside a supermarket in Tucson, Arizona. Tonight, the fight to save the congresswoman's life. Her astronaut husband rushing to her side. And the suspect now in custody. Who is he? What was his motive? And the reaction from Arizona to the White House. Tonight, a special edition of World News, the shootings in Tucson. And good evening on this Saturday night. I'm David Muir. It all began today as a routine exercise in democracy. A congresswoman in a supermarket parking lot meeting with her constituents when it suddenly became a scene of extraordinary chaos and carnage. A gunman opening fire outside that Tucson store, shooting Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords in the head and more than a dozen others. Here are the numbers at this hour. At least 5 people are dead, including a veteran federal judge and a young girl, barely 9 years old. Many, many more wounded and in the hospital. The congresswoman is battling for her life tonight after brain surgery. We're told she is responding to commands. And the suspected gunman, just 22 years old, is in custody. Giffords just began her 3rd term in Washington just this week as something of a rarity after last fall's election. She's a Democrat from a largely Republican district. She was as familiar as anyone with the partisan divide. But today, politicians on every side condemned the attack. We took note that one of today's victims in the shooting in Tucson was a federal judge. Great distinction as attorney and judge for more than 35 years. The president spoke some time ago to the nation, calling the congresswoman a friend. And speaking of those who didn't survive as well, the federal judge, John Roll, and a young girl, barely 9 years old. In fact, we are learning more tonight about the suspected gunman who left an ominous trail of videos and postings on the internet that hinted about just what would unfold. The Justice Department and the FBI have joined Arizona officials in this investigation. And as we bid farewell tonight, of course, our thoughts here at ABC with Judge John Roll's family and Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords. I'm David Muir. From all of us here at ABC News, thank you for watching. Have a good evening and good night.
This is ABC World News.
Good evening, I'm David Muir, and we are back here in Tucson tonight, where today we witnessed an extraordinary gathering right here in this church. It was 1 week ago here in Tucson that gathering outside a supermarket held by Congresswoman Giffords was stopped short by that gunman. Today, so many of the survivors and the people who saved them, all who had gathered for that Congress on Your Corner, came here to continue that conversation that they never had. It was an extraordinary and moving town hall, and you'll hear some of it in a moment. There's some of the first responders who have stepped forward for the first time to share their stories today. And all week long, we wondered about one woman in particular, the woman who was in this photograph from exactly a week ago, a sort of mystery woman, her jeans covered there in blood. Well, we're just now learning what she did that day and the meeting with the man late this week that she saved.
We wondered all week who this woman was in the corner of the picture. And we now know it was you. And when you first saw this image,
it hurt. It was difficult.
It was 1 week ago today. Anna Ballas was headed into the Safeway. So instead of going into the store, she went to that Congress on Your Corner gathering.
I looked over my left shoulder, and at the time that the gunman was standing there, and it just went from there. It just gunfire everywhere.
And all the while, people are falling all around you.
Yes.
Diving under a table and covering her head to survive, she then noticed Gifford staffer Ron Barber lying on the ground just a few feet away, shot twice.
I just crawled over on my knees, and the first thing I thought about is 2 palms, just applying pressure.
What did you say to him?
I just looked at him and I says, I'm going to try to help you the best I can.
And late this week, we learned she met the man she saved.
He kept telling me I'm his hero, and I said, let's just make it be that I was your angel. So that's what we've decided.
You're more comfortable with Angel?
Yes.
Angel, we duly note. In this church, that conversation cut short here in Tucson. They were determined to come back and continue it. It was all part of a town hall where Christiane Amanpour and I met so many of the survivors who were meeting each other for the first time.
Thank you so much for being with us.
And Christiane Amanpour joins us now. Pleasure to do the town hall with you today. And wasn't it something to see this community come together, no matter what side they're from? They want consensus.
It's absolutely remarkable, and I think that's what's impressed so many people, how the community has reacted, how they've bonded, how they want to go forward, and how even though there are still differences of political opinion, today we saw them wanting to carry on an honest dialogue, as they said, but a reasonable and rational one.
And we'll get into that dialogue about mental health and about guns tomorrow morning, but one of the things that struck me today was all of this talk about ordinary Americans doing extraordinary things.
Exactly, and so much has been said and so much has been made of these ordinary people who put themselves in the position of being real heroes.
Christiane, thank you. And finally tonight from here in Tucson, that staffer for Congresswoman Giffords who stunned us here yesterday, and apparently many of you too. It was last night here we first heard from Pam Simon, the Giffords staffer, shot in the chest and the arm.
The bullet went through my wrist and miraculously did not hit anything, so I have full use of my right hand. I also took a bullet to the chest, and when I woke up from the exploratory surgery, the surgeon said, "You are one lucky lady."
It missed every vital organ. And just like us, as we sat in that room with her, so many of you were stunned at her recovery, her bravery. But this survivor doesn't have a medical explanation. She's calling it what so many of you called it, a blessing, as she now prays for others. Back at work and already thinking of others. That is the broadcast this Saturday night. A reminder, I'll be right back here first thing in the morning for a very special This Week with Christiane Amanpour, the town hall that brought back together the survivors and many of the people who saved them. Meeting in this room for the first time, the conversation that was halted 1 week ago continues here tomorrow morning on ABC's This Week. Good night, and I'll see you again here tomorrow night.
After the tragedy, an American conversation continued right now.
Good morning. I'm here along with my colleague David Muir to gather together for the first time since that day so many of the people who were there on the scene at the hospital to talk and to make sense of what they've lived through, to continue finally that very American conversation they set out to have that morning. David Muir, you have people who you want to talk to there. Tell us their stories.
Well, Christiane, we hear about these ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The first responders at the scene, and I wanted to bring in Dr. Bilal Jose, if you could stand. And I'm curious what you've learned as someone who's trained in this by the so-called ordinary people who really did the groundwork for you.
You know, we do this every day, and that morning, you know, when I walked into the emergency room and saw so many people, and the same echoes that come from the first responders at the scene was echoed in the hospital. It was a controlled chaos that just became harmony.
Christiane?
David, who's there with a friend of Jared Lee Loughner.
Yeah, Stephen Case, if I could ask you to stand up, that would be great. And I know that you were in a poetry class with him, and we've heard a little bit about that, the trademark pink hair this week. But you have been such a valued voice because you were witness to him. You were in the same classroom with him. Were there warning signs that were missed?
The warning signs for violence? No. You know, in the class that I had with him, he made people uncomfortable. He didn't behave aggressively. I mean, and so it's hard to draw a line between someone being weird and standing out, you know, and
Tucson loves you, as we've learned from this event.
And if you're going to try to police that somehow, because, you know, again, as the sheriff said, he didn't do anything that would merit police action.
It seemed like he was a very troubled young man, and that there were people, even his math professor, who said, this is a troubled student of mine. Did you see that trouble?
You could see a lack of stability, and so that's hard to really gauge when you're not in their head.
Thank you for your honest voice this week. And I wanted to go back to Lynn, who lives across the street from the Loughner family. Yes. I know it's been a very difficult week for you, and we appreciate this is the first time you're talking, and we do appreciate it. I wonder, living across the street and with that vantage point, if you now look back and say there were signs.
I wish that I would have had more courage to have said more to his parents to help him better.
One of the things that struck me, you spoke of the music. You said there was once beautiful music coming from that house.
Yes, there was. About 4 years ago, Jared played in a jazz band. And I just loved sitting in my house, listening to that music. And something changed.
And there was a change, you said. The family stopped talking to the neighbors, and you tried to find out if it was something you or the neighbors had done. And when you asked the family, what was the answer?
There was no answer. I was just glared at and turned back on.
Dr. Laura Nelson, who's with you, David.
And I suppose the next question would be, how easy is it to pick up that phone? And is this a lesson for us all to take advantage of one of the safeguards that we've now learned is in fact in place?
Yes, it's absolutely a lesson for all of us. What we need to be focusing on now as a state and really as a country, that there are opportunities to recognize signs and symptoms much earlier, to the extent that you don't need to pull in law enforcement or necessarily call out a crisis team. If we can engage the community into recognizing that mental illness is just like any other chronic physical condition like diabetes or emphysema, it doesn't happen overnight. It is a gradual, progressive process, and the earlier we identify those signs and symptoms, we engage the individual in communication and discuss what the options are, the better opportunities we have to get them into treatment voluntarily to get assistance and get help that they need.
Christian.
Let me go to David Muir, because this issue is obviously one that is very controversial. And what we're trying to figure out is not whether guns should be allowed, but whether in certain instances there are real grounds for controlling them.
And we could point out that the Congresswoman herself, Congresswoman Giffords, was a proud gun owner and talked openly about it while campaigning and as the Congresswoman here in this district. And I wanted to bring in Jerry Hills. You're a gun control advocate, and I know it's dear to your heart. You lost someone yourself in a very similar situation.
Yes, standing here today brings me back to my beginning of this journey 16 years ago, when my younger brother, Officer Adam Hills, was shot and killed in similar circumstances. He was off duty, and the shooter involved had a long history of mental health. I have sat over the last 15 years my own experience. I have sat with families from Columbine and Virginia Tech and Otis and Lori Smith here in Arizona, who lost their beautiful daughter Shannon, who we passed Shannon's Law in memory of. And it's time for this country to have a serious conversation and forget about being a Democrat or a Republican or a gun owner or a non-gun owner. We need to do better. We can do better. And we can find common ground to stop this from happening.
Christian, Trent Humphreys is a Tea Party member, and I'm curious, Trent, if you could stand for just a moment. The Congresswoman supported the Second Amendment. She had a gun. And I'm curious, when you hear this, that there needs to be debate from Democrats and Republicans in the room, where you see us headed forward.
Well, I mean, we talk about the other things, too, as they talk about how come nobody could be aware this man had a medical history of that, but HIPAA laws would prevent that. It's not just gun laws that are standing in the way of this happening. There are all kinds of laws that Congress needs to look at. And I think there is a time for this debate, but for what we saw and felt right now, I'm not sure that applause and things going on are appropriate right now until we've actually maybe had the funerals finished for the people that were suffered and died. My neighbor was one of those people, and I loved that man. And I want to see some introspection maybe from the people before the national debate happens. Okay. You know, and it's very well to have those things, but it's something that's going to have to happen with everybody. And I mean, it's something where, as a country, we talk about political discourse and what's appropriate and what's not. I think that applies to everybody, including the media, who's you know, and not in this very, very cathartic thing for everybody, but immediately after the shooting, to see people jump to the political angles, I just don't want to see that right now, and I'm a very political person. So I would ask that maybe we have that discussion, and it's a larger discussion, and that we have that just a little bit later.
My colleague David Muir there in the audience, and you have also some people who want to talk about the political situation here.
Yes, I wanted to bring in Jason Rose, longtime Arizona political consultant, and I'm curious where you see this headed, the discourse and this talk of greater civility.
Well, it's a challenge to talk of politics at a time like this, but my observation would be this. There was a tragic shooting elsewhere in southern Arizona a year ago, and it created a wilder West. I think the effect of this is going to be, this tragedy in Tucson, a milder West. So I think the effect is going to be to have a moderating effect on the cauldron that has been Arizona.
I just want to say that it is amazing that we've been here. We've heard you grieve, we've heard you offer solutions, and we've even heard you laugh. And that is something very, very important, because it means, I think, that the human spirit remains alive, even through tragedy. So I thank you all for joining us today. From David Muir and from me, Christiane Amanpour, and all of us here in Tucson, thank you for sharing part of your Sunday with us, and we will see you next week.